David is going to make the introduction and give a sort of our latest thoughts on what the book should have been like.
Yes, that's a good characterization.
For the second edition, we will have a new preface. Then after David, we can have a first round of general discussions and points of view, and then I prepared a small example applying what David is presenting in the first part, and then we can have a second round of general discussions. But yeah, so
that sounds great.
Sounds great. Okay, so I think we can begin. I already began the YouTube transmission. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We will have a freewheeling and friendly discussion with the editors of the Cambridge History of Philosophy of the Scientific Revolution that just came out at Cambridge University Press. Their panel is entitled Transformations in the Scientific Revolution, and I think we'll start with some remarks from David Marshall Miller, and then we'll move to discussion and then to Dana Jalobanu. David, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for devoting this session to our volume. They've just let us out of the storm shelters, so I'm happy that I'll be able to give the presentation. Just a little touch and go for a moment there. Anyway, so as you all know, as Claudia just mentioned, Donna and I edited the Cambridge History of Philosophy of the Scientific Revolution, which has just come out. And as Donna mentioned, I'm very happy to see a lot of our contributors here with us today. And thanks again for all of your effort, your contributions, and your patience and forbearance. I hope everybody's satisfied with the product when you eventually get to see it. So we're talking about transformations in the scientific revolution today, because when Donna and I were first putting the volume together, we faced something of a difficult problem. And that's because recent studies in history of philosophy generally, and early modern philosophy in particular, have become much more sensitive to a wide range of intellectual and cultural influences. Most importantly, the scientific revolution, hence the perceived need for the volume in the first place. And this contextualist turn has made recent scholarship much more sensitive to the broader developments in the period. In other domains like physiology and chemistry or chemistry, and in other modes of activity like institutions and correspondence networks. And of course, that's expanded the canon and opened up a lot of new narrative pathways. And it served to reconcile, at least to some degree, the presentist analytical tendencies of historians of philosophy with the historicist narrative tendencies of historians of science. I think these days, both of those fields have become much more sensitive to what's going on in the other. And overall, this new historiography has enriched our understanding of the period. Old obsolete narratives have been superseded. You know, early modern philosophy doesn't just mean rationalist empiricists before Kant. The scientific revolution isn't just a theoretical development in physics and astronomy that starts with Copernicus and ends with Newton. Instead, scholars have begun to trace out a myriad of influences that ramify through the entire landscape of early modern thought. And as I said, that contextual historiography has been immensely valuable, but it does, however, come at something of a cost. And that is that our field has lost much of the methodological cohesion that marked older scholarship. So for instance, let's just consider Galileo Siderius Nuncius. In traditional histories, this is treated as a seminal episode that marks a shift from the dominance of Ptolemaic astronomy to Copernican astronomy, and thus contributes to the demise of Aristotelian natural philosophy and thus the birth of modern science. But today, that episode, the publication of the book, is subjected to a plethora of scholarly points of view. The publication is seen as an episode not only in intellectual history, but also in the development of knowledge-producing technology, the European trade of knowledge, the intersection of philosophy and manual arts, the revival of ancient philosophical traditions, harkening back to Plutarch and Seneca, the politicization and confessionalization of book dissemination, and on and on and on. And indeed, the proliferation of analyses has undermined the status of the scientific revolution as a historiographical category. With so much going on across the period, it's become exceedingly hard to say what counts as science, let alone as the revolution in it. And that, of course, has led some authors to throw up their hands and deny that there ever was such a thing as the scientific revolution. Now, of course, in the abstract, this is all well and good. I think we should welcome a diversity of views, but it does pose practical problems if one is trying to construct a coherent narrative from all of this, variegated recent work. How can we, as editors, put all of these different histories into a single table of contents, especially in a book that's predicated on the existence of the scientific revolution? So when Donna and I first addressed this difficulty, Donna suggested, and I agreed, that we use discipline as a unit of analysis. And my thought was something like this. If we take history of philosophy as the study of the development of ideas through arguments, then a promising mode of analysis is to find the things people were arguing about by demarcating the divides that they were arguing across. In short, we could ask, how did early modern thinkers set up the bounds of disciplines among themselves? How did historical actors set up dialectical oppositions between adversarial groups and organize themselves into positions for and against? In short, how did they identify allies and adversaries? And the advantage of this disciplinary analysis is that it allowed us to construct a narrative of disciplinary transformations without prejudging other methodological issues. A discipline, in our very generic sense, can be constituted in a multitude of ways, intellectually, socially, materially, and so on. So, for example, insofar as they serve as discursive groupings, astronomers, the Royal Society, Cartesians, all of these things can count as disciplines in the generic sense. And consequently, these disciplines can be subjected to all different kinds of historical accounts, depending on how influences and developments are analyzed. A discipline, in this sense, is compatible with strictly internalist intellectual history and sociocultural constructivism, and pretty much everything in between. And what that meant was that we could set our contributors the task of discussing how disciplines divided up the intellectual landscape, what was happening in those disciplines, and what happened when the disciplines came into contact and conflict, all without privileging one historiographical perspective over another. And thus we could end up including in a single volume essays like Karen Detlefson's study of gender roles in public and private institutions and Niccolo Guicciardini's study of notation in pure mathematics, both of which are excellent and important contributions that I highly recommend, but both exemplify very different kinds of scholarship. And so the value of the disciplinary approach is that it can comprehend both of those historiographies. Now you'll notice that on this view, the scientific revolution becomes an umbrella term that comprises all sorts of local disciplinary transformations, each of which then needs to be treated on its own terms. So there was Bacon's Great Instauration, Kepler's New Astronomy, Galileo's New Sciences, and so on. And the scientific revolution just isn't one thing, it's all of these kinds of things put together. And when Donna and I first started to sit down to talk about what we were going to say today, that's basically what we plan to talk about, the scientific revolution as a variety of disciplinary transformations. But it quickly became apparent that our notion of discipline was underdeveloped, and that we had significant differences in opinion about what exactly we were talking about. Now that hadn't come up earlier since the disciplinary approach was applied with a relatively light touch in the volume, since our intention was to let the authors construct narratives as they saw fit. And moreover, I can say that for my own part, at least my thinking has been affected by the process of putting the book together and writing my own contribution. So I think my views are a bit sharper than they once were. To her credit, I think Donna had a better sense of this stuff at the outset. So basically today you're going to see the result of very recent conversations in which we decided to offer something a little bit more programmatic about disciplinary analysis. Our thinking is that if we want to conceive of the scientific revolution as disciplinary transformations, we have to get a bit more precise about what we mean by discipline. So today, I'm going to present a taxonomy of the different kinds of discipline one finds in the intellectual activities of the early modern period. And this extends the conceptualization we used in the volume, and furthermore, might become the basis of a useful historiographical framework that can reconcile the methodological multiplicity one finds in history of early modern philosophy, history of the scientific revolution, and other cognate fields. So the hope is that the taxonomy might be a step toward bringing some cohesion back to our scholarship, at the very least by standardizing some of the vocabulary of the debate. Now, so that's the plan for today. I need to offer, however, a word of warning at the outset. I'm not proposing a fully worked out proposal today. It's still very tentative. And for one thing, that's because Donna and I approached this discussion somewhat differently. I worked top down while she worked bottom up, which is to say that I started by considering almost a priori all the ways that groups might divide themselves up, and then pruned the space of possibilities by considering how they map onto actual history. Donna, on the other hand, started from the historical record and tried to generalize. And what that means is that I'm thinking more along the lines of analyst categories here, and Donna is thinking in terms of actors categories. Now, in the end, I think that our views are at least compatible, but I do think that there remains some disagreement about nuance, which will probably become clear in our discussion. So those caveats aside, what we're interested in discussing is how disciplines are structured during the early modern period, right? So our generic sense of discipline signifies an organization of historical actors into a group. And that was accomplished by imposing bounds that could distinguish the in-group from the out-group, and which could then be enforced or appealed to when deciding who belongs. And so different kinds of discipline can be distinguished by the kinds of membership conditions used to constitute them. And that's going to be the basis of the taxonomy that we present. And so our taxonomy as it currently stands consists of a hierarchical differentiation into 3 levels, and then 2 additional categories that are sort of trans-hierarchical, standing aside. All right, so to begin, let's start with the hierarchical part of this taxonomy of disciplines.
David, don't you want to show the PowerPoint?
Oh, am I not?
You are not.
Oh, dear, I thought I was. Somebody should. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I restarted my the discussion. I restarted before, and now it's anyway. Okay, apologies. Right. So broadest category, community of practice. So the broadest taxon is what we're calling a community of practice. In some cases, this is the same thing as a profession. And membership in this kind of group requires engaging in a common form of activity that is recognized as such. And this entails adherence to a practical methodology that defines the purpose of the shared activity by setting standards for what counts as a successful activity, or what counts as a success. So for instance, the production of metal in metallurgy, the curing of a patient in medicine, the collection of specimens for naturalists, and so on. This practical methodology might also include tricks of the trade, rules of thumb that recommend certain means of achieving practical success. And note also that a community of practice often shares a descriptive instrumental language that permits communication of activities. For instance, they can share recipes within the community so that they can tell each other how to carry out the activities that constitute the community. But membership in a community of practice does not entail allegiance to any epistemic methodology. There's no standards here for theoretical success. That is to say, a community of practice does not say what would count as understanding or knowledge of the phenomena. So no theoretical commitments are necessary to enact a recipe. Some examples here would be some examples here would be doctors and mathematicians, alchemists, astrologers, professors of secrets, to use William Eamon's example. But Donna and I would also agree that humanists are a community of practice. They had a practical methodology of translation and textual criticism, but they didn't share theoretical methodologies. There were humanist philosophers, humanist astronomers, and humanist mathematicians, and so on. And they certainly didn't share theoretical commitments. There were Aristotelians and Platonists among them, for instance. Nevertheless, the term humanist was used to set up a dialectical bound that organized discourse on both sides. Humanism was something to argue about, as in Bacon's criticism of the humanists. So it counts as a significant discipline in the generic sense. It's one of these discursive groupings. Now, it might happen that a community of practice eventually adopts a theoretical methodology. And in that case, it would become a discipline in the strict sense, what will later be called a science, as in the science of statics. A discipline is a community of practice wherein the practitioners also share research aims directed towards explication and understanding. And those research aims bound the discipline by determining the domain of phenomena, that is to say, the field of study that is to be addressed, and the epistemic standards that define what would count as a successful explication. And those go beyond the standards of practical success that define communities of practice. And so together, the research aims dictate how the discipline is trying to create understanding. They establish a research program, although not in the Lakatoshian sense. So for instance, the disciplines of astronomy and astrology both address the celestial realm, but are distinguished by their standards of success. Astronomy seeks to describe the planetary motions, where astrology seeks to describe the planet's influence on terrestrial affairs. Right, so they're seeking different kinds of understanding. Now, these epistemic standards will entail a theoretical methodology of knowledge production. And that methodology might call upon the resources of other disciplines. So astronomy, for instance, is mathematical. That is to say that mathematics provides the descriptive system. And at least for pre-Copernican astronomy, there was a demand that the astronomical theories reduce motions to rotations, which were then explained on the basis of Aristotelian physics. But note that when a discipline is functional, these resources are just the background theory of the discipline. It won't feel like a borrowing to the members of the discipline. It's only when something is happening to the discipline, when it is transforming in some way, that these assumptions become relevant and or recognized as such. So but also given this theoretical underpinning, a discipline also entails a pedagogical apparatus that is sufficient to indoctrinate new members with the background theory or theories necessary to pursue the methodology. And this often came in the form of standard texts. So astronomy relies on spherical geometry, which was typically taught from Sacroboscos de Sphira. However, a discipline doesn't entail theoretical commitments within the domain. That's what's going to be provided by a paradigm. So in astronomy, there were, of course, different paradigms: Ptolemaic, Eudoxian, Copernican, and Tychonic. And but the important thing to note is that the partisans of those various theories agreed about what it is they were trying to do. That is to say, they shared research aims and thus participated in a single discipline. But they disagreed about which theory best accomplished the task. And note that this also allows for pre-paradigmatic disciplines that have research programs but no dominant theory or theories. So for instance, in the chapter in the volume, Donna and Peter Anstey present Bacon's Great Instauration as a process of discipline formation. Bacon starts with communities of practice, which are raw and unguided collections of observations of nature, as in animal husbandry or ore smelting, which Bacon himself called primary or mother natural history. He then sought to organize these communities into structured inquiries guided by an experimental methodology, and thereby constituting a discipline of experimental natural history. And then this would, Bacon hoped, spawn new subdisciplines employing the same experimental method in ever more particular domains, such as the history of the earth and sea and the history of metals. But all of this was in advance of established paradigms, right? In advance of established explanatory theories. And of course, this of course brings us to the last level of the hierarchy, what we're calling paradigms. A paradigm is something that exists within a discipline and thus adopts its domain and standards. But in addition, allegiance to a paradigm entails accepting that a particular explanatory theory is the most successful in satisfying those research aims. And a paradigm will also provide a range of theoretical and programmatic resources, including standard exemplars, set problems, techniques, vocabulary, and so on. So for example, Ptolemaic geocentrism and Copernican heliocentrism are paradigms within the discipline of astronomy. Now, in addition to this hierarchy, there are two categories that transcend it. And the bounds of one are based on ideological and intellectual commitments. The others are based on social and material conditions. Now, the first is sect or school, terms that signify shared allegiance to particular theoretical or methodological doctrines, usually attributed to a chef de sect. And the allegiance required might also extend to particular interpretations of the central doctrines. So one can be cast as an outsider for not holding the doctrines in the right way. Examples here are Aristotelians and Leibnizians. Donna and Peter also hold that there's a school of Baconians. Now note, while they share the same basic structure, insofar as they are bounded by the same kind of commitments, sect and school have slightly different connotations. Sect is a polemical label applied by its opponents, while school is a friendly self-attribution. And naturally, self-declared allegiances are going to give schools significantly more coherence. The members of a sect don't necessarily see themselves as allied. And so in her chapter, for instance, Delphine Bailly argues that there was a Cartesian school, but only a Gassendi sect, which helps account for the persistence of the one and not the other. Now note that sects and schools can cut across disciplines. So for instance, to be an Epicurean meant avowing atomism and denying providence, following the supposed views of Epicurus. But there were Epicurean doctors and Epicurean philosophers and so on. Now, somewhat controversially, I think, I think that where sects and disciplines intersect, you get a paradigm. So for instance, Paracelsianism is a school because it is transdisciplinary. There are adherents to Paracelsian doctrines in chemistry, medicine, astrology, and so forth. But the Paracelsian school of medicine would just be a paradigm within the discipline of medicine, since it's constituted by certain theoretical views of disease and treatment. Now, finally, we have institutions. And an institution is the physical or communal or social setting of intellectual or practical activity. One belongs to an institution if one acts within that setting. In other words, basically, if you do the thing there in that place. Now, in some cases, membership is going to be restricted by specific conditions of entry, but in others, it's not, right? It's free to enter into just by doing the thing. And these settings can be either concrete or notional. So on this definition, the Royal Society, the Mersenne Network, the Journal de Savant, the private home, all of these things count as institutions. And for our purposes, it's significant that institutions often have pedagogical function. The institution of apprenticeship, for instance, is important for a variety of communities of practice, while universities are the pedagogical setting for many disciplines. Now, to see how all of this works, I think it's worthwhile to consider a concrete example. So following Donna's suggestion, let's take Uraniborg, Tycho's observatory on the island of Hven. How should we describe this using our taxonomy? Well, here's how I would propose to carve this up. Uraniborg is an institution. It is the physical and communal and social setting for a variety of practices. And operating there are astronomers, of course, but also printers, instrument makers, and so on, all of which are members of the institution directed by Tycho. So working within the institution, there are astronomers who constitute a community of practice since they're engaged in a common activity. But astronomy is also a discipline since it had established research aims. Tycho's astronomers all knew what the task, all understood what the task was, namely to describe the motions of the heavens. And they agreed on a methodology to do that. They shared a descriptive system, and they agreed about how to take measurements. And that's why they could execute observations together. But within the discipline, there were adherents of different paradigms. Some of Tycho's astronomers believed in the Ptolemaic theory, some in the Copernican. Tycho himself had the Tychonic theory, and so on. So I think that's a just quick, brief example about how you might use this taxonomy to characterize what's going on in a particular case. Now, it's important to emphasize that we are proposing here a working set of categories to establish a framework for debate about how the categories might be applied. In other words, we're aiming here to provide a standard vocabulary to help sort out what we're appealing to when we describe some historical phenomena. But the categories themselves are not meant to determine their attributions. They're not supposed to be exclusive. They can be arranged in different ways or structures depending on the interpretation of the history one encounters. And of course, applying the categories will be tricky and in some cases controversial. For one thing, the distinctions here can be rather fuzzy. At what point does a practical methodology begin to call upon theoretical resources so that we're no longer describing a community of practice, but a discipline or even a paradigm? It can be hard to tell. One such example is natural philosophy. One might think that natural philosophy is a fully fledged discipline, perhaps standing over subdisciplines like cosmology and so on, or physics. Alternatively, one might deny that natural philosophy has enough methodological coherence and specific enough research aims to count as something more than a community of practice. Another extremely vague label is mixed mathematics, which can mean different things when applied to different groups of historical actors. Conversely, it can be difficult to say how an established category lines up with this taxonomy. For instance, when we talk about humanism, what are we talking about? Our view, as mentioned earlier, is that we're talking about a community of practice, since we don't think that adherence to humanism entailed enough of a methodology to make it a discipline. Others might disagree and say there was a humanist commitment to a theoretical methodology, or you might mean something else when you use the term. Again, the point here is not to decide these questions, but provide a framework for doing so. Indeed, several of the chapters in the book can be seen as attempts to hash out the constitution of various disciplines in the generic sense. So Helen Hattab's chapter on Renaissance Aristotelianisms is an attempt to show that at least by the middle of the 17th century, Aristotelian natural philosophy was a discipline with certain methodological commitments, but not a paradigm with theoretical ones, such that it was compatible with a variety of theories about the natures of things, including atomism in the case of David Gorleas. Meanwhile, Dan Garber's essay wrestles with the nature of the novatores, which I think would count as a sect created by its opponents for polemical effect. Though since he's here, he might correct me on that. Now, let me close just by returning to the question of the usefulness of the scientific revolution as a historiographical category. Donna and I are committed to the view that there was such a thing. We even made a book about it. The early modern period did include a radical revision of the understanding of the natural world that marked a rupture with the past. So what was it? What kind of transformation? Now, I don't think it'll be surprising to hear, given all of what I've just said, is that we think it was a combination of all the different ways these generic sense disciplines could transform. So at the very least, it wasn't just a Kuhnian revolution, a paradigm replacement within a discipline. Rather, communities of practice became disciplines, disciplines took over new domains, institutions were founded, sects emerged and died out, and so on. So asserting that the scientific revolution was a variety of disciplinary transformations does justice to the complicated history of the period and to the patchwork state of the current literature. And so to end on a hopeful note, the hope is that this analysis might point the way towards a new consensus. Where there are disagreements about how to treat the histories, this taxonomy offers a framework within which to hash out those disagreements. It provides, at least it seems to provide, a common conceptual basis by which we might understand each other's divergent historiographical tendencies. And that in turn might restore some disciplinary cohesion to our field, at least at a meta-historical level. Now, I'll admit to some hope here, but the true test is if anything that I've presented thus far resonates with the audience. So in reality, it's up to you. And so I welcome comments and questions. And I'm honestly interested to see if this is a useful categorization in your work. And thank you.
Right, so I think what you had decided on was that we were going to have a short discussion on this and then move on to Donna's presentation. Is that right?
Yeah, that would be helpful for us too, so that we see how to address further questions.
Great, so questions. I see that Dan has his hand up.
Dan, but we don't hear you. You need to switch on the mic.
I was saying Erica also has her hand up.
Oh, yeah.
At the same time, why don't let her go first?
Okay, Erica Tucker.
Hi, thank you. So I find this incredibly useful. I'm arguing, he doesn't really know about it yet, but with Eric Schlieser about this, specifically related to Spinoza. And so I find this categorization not just incredibly helpful in general, but specifically helpful in, I mean, I've been using a variety of terms to reject. So Schlieser argues that Spinoza, with respect to the scientific revolution, can't even be counted a fellow traveler. Now that strikes me as a very broad, you have not used that term fellow traveler, but I take that to be like even broader than your broadest categorization. And so it's a framework that I will immediately be using. So it's helpful in that sense. But I think I still have a question about the following. And so here's the question part. So that was just cheerleading. Thank you. And Eric Schlieser is wrong. Thank you. He's not here to defend himself, but I just like to get that in if I can, about Spinoza and science. Poor Eric. He's such a lovely person. Sorry. So I feel bad. specifically, what about the word science? If we find these people using the English word science, as we very well might, can we talk about them doing science asterisk? So this term still drives people nuts, right? And so I think, what do we say about that? So that's just, you can answer that now, or that's just my question that remains. So thank you.
Actually, I might have something to say about this in my example, which is about scientia, but David, if you want to say something.
I mean, this gets to one of those nuances that Donna and I disagree about. Yeah, I mean, we have to be careful, and we have to be careful about what people mean when we find it as a historical, you know, in the historical record. I think that we have to address case by case. But I do think that there's a broader question, is like, well, what if the scientific revolution gave birth to modern science, right? As some people think, that I think, what is the core central, what's the core central move that happened during the quote unquote scientific revolution that brought about modern science? My own view is that that science is a discipline, and what you see emerging in the scientific revolution is the coalescing of the cohesion and the coalescing of a constellation of norms that define the theoretical methodology of science. And so on this taxonomy, that science counts as a discipline. And I know Donna disagrees with this, so she might have her own views.
No, but that on particular question, I mean, science is just a translation of the scientia, and scientia is not science by any means. So science
No, of course.
Is much.
No. Yeah. Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you, all three. Dan Garber.
Thank you very much, David. It sounds a bit like Pittsburgh, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a little analytic, isn't it?
I think it's wonderful, but I'm a little bit skeptical. And when you said, in part because of where it is that I'm coming from, which is the chapter that I wrote was on the Novatores. I was a little surprised that you called it a sect. I'm not sure about the distinction between sect and school, but I think the Novatores don't really count as either. They don't have the coherence of even, for example, the Cartesians or the Gassendists. There's a wonderful quotation that I think I may include in the article from a late 17th century Dutch philosophy professor who says, about all of these characters, and the characters that he's talking about are the characters that were commonly called the Novatores, usually beginning with Telesio, Campanella, Patrizii, Bacon, Basson, and another half dozen or dozen other people who are often grouped together, including some people who did become canonical, like Bacon and Galileo and Descartes, but for the most part who weren't. And what he said is, I'm not even going to take those. He's talking about sort of the development of what we would call sects or schools. He said, I'm not even going to take those into account because they really had nothing in common, except for the fact that in one way or another, they wanted to do something new. And that, I think, is that group of people who I think were certainly important historiographically in the first half of the 17th century, and became more and more marginal, I think, later in the 17th century. Really presents, I think, a different view of what it is that's going on. And the way in which I think of it is, well, if there was a revolution, it took a long time, maybe a century and a half to actually come to conclusion. It was more like the Protestant Reformation, where the freedom to, in the Protestant Reformation, the freedom to step outside of Orthodox religion, the Catholic Church, gave rise to a whole slew of different religions. And I think the freedom to step outside of the Orthodox Aristotelian framework gave people the freedom to sort of try out all sorts of new things. And and so you have people like Bacon and people like Descartes and people like Galileo, who are not only competing with the Aristotelians, which is what they think of as what they're doing, but they're competing with one another as well. And I think that that's a somewhat more chaotic picture than the one that you're drawing in your diagram.
May I try to answer this, David, just to give Dan a counterexample? There's a very good counterexample, which is the Epicurean sect, which is as diffused as your Novatores. Epicureans do not recognize each other as partners.
Yep.
They are totally parallel in discourses to one another, and they are identified by this label by their enemies. And if you really look for common threads in the Epicurean sect, you don't find any common. You have some sort of very, very general family resemblance around the atoms, but even their atoms are very, very different. Right. And you have very, very general family resemblance around the relationship between God and creation and matter.
Absolutely.
But even there is very, very, so you have this very interesting, and that's what we call sects here, okay? I think.
Why do you call them a sect?
Because they cannot
recognize one another. They don't.
Because they emerge out of, let's call it sectarian debates, in the same way in which, Zwinglians emerge out of sectarian debates, or Calvinists emerge out of sectarian debates. I mean, that's why I'm calling them this way, because out of sectarian debates, people are grouped together by their enemies, and they are somehow, they find themselves in the same camp, even if they are not. They wouldn't have grouped themselves in the same camp if they had the choice.
Yeah, but that's exactly what's going on with the Novatores. They are defined by their enemies for the most part, though later in the 17th century, they come to define themselves. They come to see themselves as, I guess, kind of a sect. But I think my point would be simply that the climate is much more fluid than David's neat categorization might suggest.
David would,
yeah. So the categorization isn't supposed to be fixed. These categories aren't supposed to be diachronically fixed. Let me propose that what you've described is that the Novatori, so using the terminology that I presented, what you've described then is that the Novatori start off as a sect, as a grouping that is a polemical label that's applied by opponents. They start off as a sect. Maybe later they develop into something of a school where some of the people adopt allegiance or declare allegiance. And then the quote that you started with earlier indicates that the sect had died out by the end of the period, that it was no longer being treated as a grouping, as a even as something that's a polemically useful category, right? So that is that would that characterization
Yeah,
fit?
no, I guess that might. I'm not sure at that point what the advantage of calling them a sect or a school is. I don't think that they ever became a school. I'm or a sect. I think what happened is you have a group of misfits, each of whom sees himself, mostly himself, as, starting something new that everybody else should follow. And over the course of the century, some of them emerge as, having sects or schools, or being
Right.
giving rise to sects or schools, and the rest of them just get forgotten.
Right.
I think that's what happened, for example, with Descartes. I mean, that quotation that I'm alluding to is somebody. This comes in a polemical work against Descartes, who was initially one of that group, but came to be, of course, the leader of a sect or a school. This professor was certainly not meaning to dismiss Descartes. He thought he was worth taking seriously enough to write 100 pages of refutation and interpretation and, of him. So.
And who was that, Dan?
His name was Gerardus de Vries, and he was a professor at Utrecht, a follower, actually, a couple of generations after Fisches, who was one of Descartes' opponents. But he was a very popular professor in the 1670s, 80s, and 90s.
Thank you, Dan. Terry Bristol, a question?
Yeah, so I would suggest that well, first of all, let's say there was a scientific revolution relative to what? And so in essence, the scientific revolution would be like this meta paradigm in your category, within which, Kuhnian type things happen in different disciplines and stuff. But and of course, obviously, maybe not. But you want to ask, what is it excluding? What is it throwing out? And I would say the first thing is the historical things. One of the things that seems to be, at least eventually, common to all the sciences is methodologically is induction. Okay, or making inductive inferences. And inductive inferences, have a presupposition about, uniformity of time, past and future. I just happened to be actually today rereading Steve Gould's treatment of time's arrow and time's cycle in the whole of geology and the discovery of deep time and stuff. And you see in that, and he traces it all the way back, that there are two traditions that go way back, one of which has this uniformity of space-time, everything's the same, always has been the same. I mean, not just a biblical thing, but there's and comes up through Lyell and Hutton, who make vigorous arguments that sound to me very Parmenidean. And of course, the opposite is the Heraclitan thing, saying, no, everything's changing, everything's going on, it's different places, different things. So those large-scale things, I think what happens in what I'd be inclined to call the scientific revolution was that one group took the high ground. And I agree with Dan that it's all very messy, actually, but the people who took the high ground were to say, oh, well, science is science and it works and induction's good. And therefore, and the fact that we can't understand the justification of induction, we don't care, but because induction is what defines science and so forth. So anyway, one of the implications of what I'm trying to say is that I think within each discipline, and it may be the way you're doing it within each paradigm, there's always a split. I haven't written this up. I haven't. You can go in. I mean, it's not in like what Gould's talking about in geology. You find it in physics later, at least in quantum theory. You got particle people and wave people and so forth. So that within any discipline, within any discussion, there's always this kind of dialectical opposition. And I think that's as fundamental, and it's incorporated in what you're saying, David, but I would just take it as a more fundamental characteristic of the advance of knowledge and so forth. Anyway.
So just quickly, so first of all, I don't want to say that the scientific revolution is a meta paradigm, right? It's all of these things put together. But I am sympathetic. Me personally, I don't want to speak for Donna here, but me personally, I'm sympathetic to the view that the scientific revolution is defined by the development of a theoretical methodology. It might include induction. I'm personally not so committed to that, but I'm sympathetic to the view that there is sort of a methodological basis, a methodological development. Now, on this taxonomy, on what we've described, that would count as a discipline, right? Because valuing inductive inferences would be a method of knowledge production, a theoretical methodology on this view. And so that would count as the development of a new discipline. But I also don't think that the scientific revolution is only that, because there's all sorts of other things that are going on as well, like the development of new institutions, different activities, right? Technological advances as well. So there's a whole range of things. So I'm sympathetic to the view that there's sort of a central meaning of the scientific revolution that hinges on the development of a new discipline. But I don't think it's only that.
But David, when you appeal for a methodology, I mean, Paul Feyerabend was one of my mentors. Wrote some against method, and like, okay, whoa, scientific method, where is that? I mean, it isn't there. There ain't no such thing, except, right. I mean, this thing between, this distinction between discovery, methods of discovery, and methods of justification. In justification, yes, it all looks like, oh, it was all very systematic, and this led to the, the positivist stuff. But in fact, if you look at the history of the whole thing, that the methodology is very empirical. It's searching, it's trying to discover. Anyway, so there is no scientific method to be the counter argument there.
Sure.
But we embrace induction after the fact.
I just wanted to say that when we talk about methodology around disciplines and communities of practice, we do not mean by that the Kuhnian or Popperian or Feyerabendian or any of the scientific method, the stories of scientific methodology of the 20th century. We merely mean what a laboratory scientist would mean by a methodology, okay? So the totality of norms of observation or inferences or practices or whatever regulates the practices. It's a very generic mean of methodology.
I don't see the difference there, sorry, because I mean, if they're saying observations and inductions, anyway.
I think we have to let David reply and then wrap this up. Yes.
Yeah, just quickly, I think what Donna and I are saying here is that so within this discipline, within this set of norms, you can have a variety of different approaches, right? You talked about the dialectical opposition, right? And that's permitted within the discipline. And so what you're talking about like, different conceptions of scientific method might be different ways of achieving the norms of what we're calling the discipline. So there might be a confusion as to what level we're speaking at here.
Thank you, David. Sophie Roux.
Thank you. So I waited 2 or 3 years before discovering that I took part to a volume on disciplines, better later than never. I have to confess that I'm a bit skeptical about what you presented. I mean, and I'm going to come back to the premises of what you presented when you said that basically you were worried because there was no coherence, no consensus, no cohesion nowadays. And I have the impression that what you would like, in a sense, is to come back to a kind of unique ground narrative and that you want to reach that through basically through a reform of language. We have to have a few terms, and we have to use the terms. But the problem is that, well, I have at least two problems with that and two questions. One is that we are not going to use the terms in the same way. I mean, the discussion on school versus sect was an example, and I would say, I would say that, for example, the Cartesians were called a sect. They called themselves Messieurs les Cartésiens, and I used to call them a party because they were really behaving as people who wanted to conquest power. So, you know, you have all these different appellations, and I mean, as long as we explain what we mean by the terms, we don't need to have the same terms, and it's not by having the same terms that we are going to avoid to reach consensus. Because as soon as you have put a term, then somebody says, no, I don't agree with this, with that, and so on and so forth. And then I have a bigger issue, I think, which is why would be pluralism a problem? I mean, why don't you accept that we have different narratives? Why I don't say that it's not a problem, but I would like to know and to understand why you consider it as a problem. And I must say that, I mean, since many years, something which has been on my mind personally is a question how to articulate or not to articulate, but what to do with the fact that on the one hand, we have what could be called a social history, which deals with people, real people, their struggles, their lives, their failures sometimes, their even conditions of life. I mean, how to earn a life, what do you do? And on the other hand, you have ideas that are explained, presented in text. And for me, it's not that I wouldn't speak of incoherence, but I think that really for me at least, and I'm sure that other people do agree with that, there is really a question, what do we do with these two levels, so to speak? On the one hand, the real life of people, on the other hand, the ideas of people, and how do we succeed or not to make a single story? But as I said, it's not a matter of reaching a consensus, but basically, so I spoke a lot, but basically my two main points are, do you really believe that you can reach a kind of consensus by fixing or pretending to fix the meaning of a few terms? And second, why do you want consensus rather than pluralism? It's not a problem. I mean, we are living in pluralist societies, and we enjoy that. So.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, first of all, it took us a while to figure out what book we were putting together too, so you're not alone in that. Now, to respond to your question, let me preface by my response is that I don't think that we're aiming towards some sort of grand narrative. I don't think we're trying to achieve. I don't think what we're trying to achieve is, you know, a grand consensus on what happened. You talked about that we're trying to reform the language, and I do think that that's what we're aiming to do here. Now, as far as like what problem we're trying to solve, I honestly think that there might be a difference between what's happening in the Anglophone world and what's happening in outside of it. But you speak of social history versus intellectual history. At least in my experience, it's often the case that practitioners of those different fields can't even, they're just so apart, so divergent that there's no way that they can really converse anymore. A lot of the people here, our work sort of sits between the stools, and so we can do it, but more broadly, there's a problem with making, to use categorical labels again, but historians of science and historians of philosophy, it's hard for them to converse. And that I do think is a problem, right? Because it's no longer pluralism, it's more just ships passing in the night. And so I do think that there is a value of trying to standardize some vocabulary so that each group can do what they want to do, and each person can approach the history as they see fit. But at least they can speak in terms that make sense to one another. And I think one value of the taxonomy that we presented is that there are aspects of it that are intellectual, and there are aspects of it that are social. And there are ways then to talk about how these different things intersect, how, for instance, institutions might intersect with disciplines, or institutions might get captured by paradigms. And so, whereas the institution is a socially constituted thing, and the paradigms and disciplines are intellectually constituted things. So I think there's value in that regard. And then maybe more specific to the Anglophone world, but I see Dan has a finger.
Yeah. And Sophie, do you also want to follow up?
No, but I do agree that there is a split between social and intellectual historians in most of the countries. But then the problem would be that, our volume is gathered. You gathered people who basically, to put it bluntly, are on the intellectual side. If they read social historians or historians, there are historians of philosophy, historians of science who began basically by reading Descartes and Galileo, or Newton. I don't want to offend anybody, so Newton as well, and Bacon as well. But if you want to gather two communities, then you cannot decide on your own what is a good language. You would have to gather these people and to find ways of, giving their voices, so to speak. So, as I said, it's not against. There were huge debates at the French Société de Philosophie at the beginning of the 20th century, when they began to standardize. They wanted to standardize the language of philosophy, and I have a lot of sympathy for the people who wanted to do that. But then what they did was really to try to be as inclusive as possible, in their outreach. And if you have a volume with only people of one side, it's not going. And if your aim is to gather 2 or 3 or more communities, it's not going to work that way, I would say.
Let me defend a bit the volume. The volume is as it is.
The volume is great.
No, that some people dropped out. It wasn't as if we planned from the beginning to represent a party here. We had more diverse views at the beginning, but as you know, things are shaped by chance as well as by plans. So we regret that, for example, we wanted to have a very good chapter on alchemy that we don't have in the volume. It would have been very important, especially in view of this idea of communities of practice. And also, I don't think that David wanted to impose the standard language on anyone, not even tonight. What we want to do, I think, with this proposal, is to propose yet new categories to explain what we cannot still explain, which is the disciplinary drive of the 17th century that has been put under the big label, the scientific revolution. And up to some point in the history and philosophy of science, this was just described in terms of discipline, crisis, new disciplines, crisis, the Kuhnian vocabulary, which is insufficient for the diversity of things that were going on. So far from trying to impose a kind of fewer number of concepts, I thought we are expanding the number of concepts that we can use in order to talk about the transformations that took place. And I'm sure that, that doesn't mean that these are the only concepts. These are some of the concepts we want to introduce, and some of the distinctions we think are maybe important in order to understand better the kinds of, again, the disciplinary, the disciplinary drive, the fact that everyone seemed to want to build new disciplines in the 17th century. And basically what we are saying, and I think everyone is saying in the volume, is that there is no univocal way in which you can see this as being the same, the same new disciplines. A discipline like the medicine of the mind developing from the logic, as in Sorana and Kuhn's chapter, is not the same kind of discipline as the natural and experimental history, or not the same kind of discipline as the classical mechanics of the end of the 17th century. They are new products, but they are new products of different kinds, and we need new names perhaps for these new products.
Dan and then Erica have follow-ups.
Great. I just want to return to something David said about the difference between sort of sociology of science or sociological approaches and the sort of thing that people with philosophical background inclined toward, intellectual history. There's a sociology to that as well. And I think that what has happened is, this is what I lived through as I went through graduate school and was interested in this stuff and worked in these areas. History of science moved from HPS departments to independent history of science departments to being, at least in the United States, parts of history departments. This is exactly what happened with history of science at Princeton, which began with Kuhn and Hempel and Gillespie getting together and forming an HPS department. That exploded, so they then moved to a history of science department, and they're now part of the history department. One of the things about being a historian in a history department is there is tremendous emphasis on archival history, which pushes the kinds of projects that people are doing in particular ways. Among another great pressure in history departments is to move outside of Europe and the sort of European sphere and look at what it is that's going on in the rest of the world. Not surprisingly, historians of science in history departments who are intending to get jobs in other history departments are going to be influenced by that, and the kinds of projects that they're doing and the approaches that they take reflect that. It's really interesting stuff. It is not perhaps quite what those of us who were originally trained, as Sophie said, on Descartes and Galileo and Bacon, are comfortable with. I think one of the interesting things, as I understand, for example, French and Italian history of science is they are still more connected with philosophy departments. Not entirely, but they're more connected with philosophy departments than for example, in North America. And so for that reason, I think it is easier for us to form a kind of intellectual community. But, you know, I'm with Sophie. I think I'm with Terry, if I understand his sort of Feyerabending instincts. I was very attracted to Feyerabend as well. You know, seeing, you know, the diversity, seeing in a certain sense the chaos as part of what's attractive about the history of science, and resisting a bit the attempt to sort of make things neater than they really are.
To Dan, should we just move to Erica now and then to Dana's
Sure,
presentation?
that's
If everyone's fine with that.
I really had just, that is a seems like a big, important statement. I'm just going to ask one tiny thing, which is, I think just to go back to the foundation of Sophie's worry about a single coherent narrative, one of the things that came up in David's discussion at the beginning was things like, he said things like a single coherent narrative or a coherent narrative. And so I think that that's still there. Like, it's fair that you don't want to do that, but there are definitely, that's what I was wondering about that too. And I think the second issue is when you try to obviously, you know, when we try to create new terms for things, sometimes those terms already have a meaning, as you well know. And I think one of the things that's come up in the discussion here that didn't occur to me earlier, but really is true, and particularly with some of the connections you've made to the Reformation, is that sect actually is one of those things that isn't, and you've of course explained the development from sectarian debates, but it does strike me as I tend to think of that as a group that is really coherent. They might be really small, but they really agree on something in a really intense way, rather than being like this party, let's say, right, or the other terms. And I think that's the danger of, you know, I mean, that's a small point in a way, because I don't actually think you're trying to wrangle chaos. I think what you've done is to try to help give people the language to and some sort of conceptual framework to refer to when they're having disagreements of this kind that they don't have words for, is right. And I think to me it's quite useful in that sense. And I do think chaos wrangling is, I mean, yeah, I'm against it. So, but I wonder what you think about that, particularly things like sect. Yeah, thanks.
Just quickly to respond, when I was talking about coherent narratives, I meant for the purposes of this book, not more broadly. Right? So, yeah.
Yeah, just a very brief comment on the actors category versus historiographic category. I mean, we are doing this all the time. Most of our historiographic categories are also actors categories, and this is where the whole confusion sometimes comes from. But if we clarify each time what we mean and where do we stand, whether we stand in a, you know, whether we want the historiographic category to make a bit of sense and group things together and put problems together, or quite the opposite, to set them apart for purpose of explaining and clarifying, then we have to do that. And sect, yes, I mean, this is one of those terms. But it has been used in the sense in which we are talking now as well. I mean, when people were talking about the Newtonian sect, they were talking and in the sense, in the labeling sense that we are discussing, not in the, and also when, you know, when in the Protestant wars, various sects, I mean, the Calvinists were labeled Calvinists, didn't recognize them as being Calvinists. Sometimes they were quite on opposite parts of a war. On the other hand, of course, there were small sects, and you can see this in terms of philosophical sects. Epicureans were never a sect in a sectarian small group of people that all said the same. Meanwhile, you can say that perhaps I don't know, Platonists were at some point. I don't know. But in any case, Platonists in like Ficinian Platonists, the Florentine Platonists. But again, so both terms were used in the 16th and 17th century. And this is the case for most of the terms that we are picking up, cherry picking, I agree, to decide what would be a new good historiographic category.
I like
I'll just throw
political party.
So I just want to throw in a plug that there's an excellent discussion of the use of actors and analyst categories in Sophie's chapter in the book. So
I'd offer the word cult.
I think political party actually captures a lot of what it is that's going on. A group of people, any political party that I know of, and this is, I agree with Sophie. I've used this term, a number of times in the past. Within any political party, there are going to be all sorts of differences of opinion, and even opposite political parties, at their extremes may converge. But these are the people you feel comfortable with. These are the people who you voluntarily associate with.
And this is a very Anglo-American view of the party. I mean, our parties in Romania are made of people who cannot stand each other. They're bound by mafia rules and, their allegiances.
What can I say? Maybe so. Maybe so.
That just confuses the matter even more because it introduces our biases into the 17th century.
Can I make one comment that this from sects to cults, and that is Laughlin, I can't remember his first name now, it's down at Stanford, and we were talking about some of this stuff. And he talked about what he called the Einstein cult. And what he meant by that is an active, it's kind of like a political party, but it's a group that actively attempts to suppress other points of view. In fact, Freeman Dyson told me that when he was at the Institute, he was under the thumb of Oppenheimer, and one of his assignments was anybody who came up with an alternative approach to the questions, Dyson's job was to go and attack them and point out all the problems that they had, neglecting, of course, the problems with the own view of those people. But that sort of war within academia, I think, is fairly common. And you see it in Gould's, again, treatment of these guys. Anyway.
I'm happy we're not a cult yet. Dana, shall we move to your...
Are you sure?
Yes, if you agree, then I will try to sort of offer a kind of discussion. I don't have answers. I rather have questions. But it might work as a sort of illustration of what we have been discussing so far. And I propose we discuss the case of Baconian natural history, natural and experimental history. We have a chapter in the book on that. And we work with Peter, we were kind of, I remember, struggling with whether this is a discipline or is not a discipline or what it is. And I'm going to propose this object here and see whether our new categories are helping in any way to make any sort of light. We are back, and I have to tell you that with this, we are back to the confusion from the light and clarity of the first part of this evening, because we are going to look at some historical examples, and they are never so neat. Anyway, so the point with the natural and experimental histories is that they are a basis, okay, as we all know, for the construction of the Scientiae. And Bacon had all sorts of ideas about how to do that. And here is a map, because Bacon considers that a map of knowledge is essential for this procedure of raising from natural and experimental histories various new sciences, where sciences is a translation of the Scientiae. So it means just the Aristotelian knowledge organized according to the schema, principles, and syllogistic development from principles. Also, to cut the long story short, Bacon was never able to develop any full developed Scientiae, but he has some ideas of how this can be eventually done. And natural and experimental history plays an important role in this development. And now the question is this object a discipline, a community of practices, there is a Baconian sect perhaps, or is it a school, or is it something else altogether? I didn't think of the institution, so there we have the object called the institution, and maybe we want to discuss a bit whether that's, but I thought it has never been institutionalized in the proper sense, so I thought that maybe these are the four things that that are relevant for understanding better what this object is, Baconian natural and experimental history. This is a historical object. We have it we have ample samples of this object in the 17th century. All sorts of people claim that they are developing a Baconian natural and experimental history, or that they are working towards developing one. So, for example, when Boyle was writing Experiments and Observations Touching Cold, he was saying that he's working towards developing an experimental history of cold. So this is preliminary work towards that. When Childray started writing his Britannia Baconica, which looks like more traditional natural history, in fact, if you read, even if you read this title, you see that this is a very complex object, written according to the precepts of Bacon, methodically digested, with the causes of many phenomena attempted. So it's a theoretical object, not a just fact gathering, and so on and so forth. There are ample examples of objects that claim to be natural and experimental histories in the 17th century. And if we read an introductory paragraph of Henry Oldenburg's Introduction to the Philosophical Transaction of 1670, the Royal Society has been around for a certain amount of time already, and this is a kind of summing up of what we have done so far. Oldenburg said we have made an attempt of laying some foundation for the improvement of real philosophy and for the spreading of useful knowledge in publishing, and it follows a list. Advices and directions for the writing of an experimental natural history. Mark that this is a methodological object. Advices and directions for the writing of this thing, experimental natural history. In pointing out essays, patterns, and exemplars, these are different objects. So these are sort of exemplar natural and experimental histories. And he's using three terms, of which two are Baconians, patterns and exemplars. I'm giving you a pattern of a natural and experimental history, or an exemplar natural and experimental history, but he's also using the essays, the trials. Okay, so that have been hitherto been designed in that kind, and giving notice of diverse artificial engines and instruments, which may be helpful for the further discoveries of nature or for the greater performances of art. Now, this is a very Baconian paragraph here, illustrating the diversity of experimental investigations within the Royal Society that somehow fitted under this very, very big umbrella of natural and experimental history. And Bacon himself wrote a number of such very diverse things. And in our chapter with Peter Anstey, we said that, well, there are at least these two very big, very broad natural and experimental history, one with some classificatory purposes, one experimentally driven. But Bacon also talks about some sort of modern natural history, which is a collection of facts, observations, and experiments, which comes first or before any kind of ordering. And then Bacon himself offers more theoretically organized natural and experimental histories, of which sometimes he talks as if they are natural and experimental histories of qualities, which is all right if we talk or think about the history of dense and rare or the history of heavy and light. But it's a bit more tricky to say that history of life and death is a history of qualities. So again, in Bacon, we see already that behind the label, there is a diversity. And Bacon also talks about the deficients, desiderata, patterns, and exemplars as objects of his project that he puts forward in order to be further developed by other experimental philosophers. And he describes them especially in his late works, and especially in his preface to the Historia Naturalis et Experimentalis, but especially in the Augmentis Scientiarum, namely in this one, published in 1623. And you have here the English translation of it, published in Oxford in 1640, in a way that's already very much Royal Society, kind of reorganizing Bacon. And there is also another English edition later, so that was kind of popular book that everyone read. And in this book, at the end, Bacon constructs a classification, or maybe just a list, of the desiderata or deficients, empty spots, and plans to fill the empty spots on the map of the sciences. And if you look at the list of what he lists there, this is again a very, very diverse thing. So a more traditional category would be an experimental or mechanical history, for which he finds names for everything. He finds the kind of amusing name of vincula naturae. But you find a very different thing called the Historia Inductiva, which is a very large-scale natural history for the building up of the whole philosophy. Or you find these objects here, the Astronomia Viva and the Astrologia Sana, which are new disciplines or new scientiae, okay? A new astronomy, a physical astronomy, and a reformed sound astrology are supposed to be new scientiae. And then he lists here the Sapientia Veterum, his story about fables. He lists here his Experientia Literata. He lists here his Novum Organum. They are all part of the desiderata that the new world of sciences has to complete. They are unfinished products, unfinished intellectual products that have to be completed by future generations. And if we look through the list of desiderata, we can find a recurrent phrase. I'm giving you, Bacon says, examples and patterns of arts and sciences. And they have different degrees of sophistication. Some of them are merely suggestions. What can be this Astrologia Sana? It's not entirely clear, although some people did try to build it in the 1640s. In some cases, they are more developed. And again, some people try to build this stuff. So in the past couple of years, I've been working on how various people in the 17th century tried to develop the unfinished bits and pieces that Bacon put together under these names. And what is interesting now, if we think about the disciplinary drive, we have here all sorts of new sciences, new contents of knowledge, that occupies these intermediate positions, empty intermediate positions on the map of the sciences. And they develop in two ways in Bacon's view. Somehow they develop from the existing sciences by borrowing axioms from one science to another, by borrowing methods from the existing sciences. And that's why charting the whole world of sciences has heuristic values, because by identifying the empty spots, you can see which science can mix with what science, more particularly which science can mix with mathematics. That's what Bacon wants, that you have new sciences in which axioms of physics and axioms and methods of mathematics are put together, and the new science will be a mixed mathematical science. And the other way of developing new sciences is starting bottom up from corresponding natural histories. So it's a completely empty plot. You have to start from the natural experimental history and build inductively, let's say, I don't know, build somehow some new science. And the common picture is that Bacon has natural histories, okay, let's say a natural history of the heavens, for example, on which he builds a new science, let's say a new astronomy, a physical astronomy. He has a natural and experimental history of dense and rare, on which some new science can be built, whether that would be a science of the air, a la Boyle, or whether that would be a science of more general science of matter, or whether it would be a science of the process of rarefaction, I'm not going to discuss here. And then who knows what would be the corresponding science of the history of life and death. Maybe, well, I don't know, I'm not speculating, but that's a common picture, that you have natural histories, and somehow on the top of natural histories, with the help of Bacon's method, you develop sciences. Well, but maybe not in such a simple manner. Because first of all, the road from natural and experimental history to scientiae doesn't go straight forward. It goes through another theoretical object, which Bacon calls inquiries. And there are all sorts of inquiries, exact, inexact, and so on. And that's as far as he ever went into developing inquiries. He never went as far as the scientiae. But that's not the only difficulty. The other difficulty, okay, and inquiries, just to give you a very, very brief characterization of them, they are organized around phenomena or processes. So inquiry into the rarefaction of matter, for example, or an inquiry later in his life, Bacon develops, I claim, general inquiry into a phenomenon called concoction, which is the process which transforms crude matter into oily and concocted matter. But these are inquiries organized around phenomena, but there is also an inquiry organized around, I'm starting again. So these two, rarefaction and concoction, so the inquiries of rarefaction and concoction are organized around a process of nature. But there are also inquiries organized around phenomena, such in the history of winds. What inquiries have in common is that they are always experimentally driven. They start from experiments, and then you start in developing these experiments, which incidentally are not any kind of experiments, but what Bacon calls prerogative instances or instances of special power. So especially fruitful, especially enlightening experiments, choice experiments, set problems that open up interesting questions. And by going along in the laboratory with these experiments and developing them, you develop basically inquiries. And inquiries, of course, are theoretical objects. They are guided by queries, by advice, by observaciones. So there are all sorts of theoretical elements in these inquiries, but there is no explanatory theory. There is a merely provisional theory and some sort of causal correlations. There is also a background theory, the general matter theory of spirits and tangible matter. So background theory and provisional explanatory causal correlations, but no fully blown explanatory theory, and even less syllogistic organization. But this is not the only problem. If we think of what is natural and experimental history. So if we take inquiries into account, then Baconian natural and experimental history is a mixture of more primary observations and experiments plus the inquiries. So everything which is below what Bacon never managed to organize and write, namely the scientiae. So Baconian natural and experimental histories would contain these two levels. But that's not the only problem. A more serious problem is that you don't have this one-to-one correlation, namely that in order to construct the science of astronomy, you have a natural history of the heavens, and that's it. From one given natural and experimental history, you can go into all sorts of directions. So, for example, if you have a natural history of the heavens, something that Bacon very much wanted to have, you can develop both a discipline or scientiae of astronomia viva and the astrologia sana, and maybe you can develop other things as well. I mean, there's no way to say that this is one natural history, one science. This is even more clear if you take the history of life and death. You can see that it contains inquiries that can go into all sorts of directions. It can go into the direction of a new science of vegetation. It can go into the direction of a new and reformed medicine. But what kind of medicine? For the prolongation of life, or rather a medicine that would spot and cure the ways of death, as Bacon put it. So the construction, the theoretical construction from natural and experimental history is not simple, doesn't go along one single direction, doesn't end in one single science. And now if we think in terms of the vocabulary that we have proposed tonight, it's very tempting to say, well, there are some disciplines. Here are some disciplines. There is the discipline of Astronomia Viva, of Bacon's physical astronomy. This is what he wants to organize there. He wants to organize a discipline eventually. And also he wants to organize an Astrologia Sana. And what happened after Bacon is that some people took the natural history of the heavens and some precepts from somewhere else and started developing Baconian sciences, such as the Astrologia Sana or Reformed Medicine or other such Baconian sciences. So what is the natural expert? If this is true, if indeed there is an attempt to develop Baconian sciences in the 17th century, especially around the Royal Society, then where does this lead the natural and experimental history? Well, is there a discipline here? There is clearly a disciplinary drive behind the 17th century attempts to devise new and new natural and experimental histories of hot and cold, of firmness and solidity, that's Boyle again, even those of various countries. But the authors of such natural and experimental histories clearly treat their exploits as being not yet a scientiae. In some cases, as you see in the case of Boyle, there are even those who are saying, well, it's even less than inquiries or natural and experimental histories organized, properly speaking. It's merely material for that. So they are merely materials for the building, preliminary database for the building of the scientiae. So it looks like if we see in this way, then natural and experimental histories are not disciplines. And the whole thing of natural and experimental history is not a discipline. Now, are there communities of practice? Again, in some cases, the practitioners of a particular Baconian natural history have common methodological rules. They have standards of success and methods of observations, experimentation, and measuring. This is something that, together with Vana Matei, we tried to show that it happens in a Baconian attempt to build a science of vegetation on natural and experimental histories of concoction, let's say, or fermentation. And there you can see that there is a community of practice, a reformed one, coming from in some part from the tradition of husbandry, but there are other people coming in. So it's a mixed bag of practitioners there, but they do recognize each other as belonging to the same group. So there is a community of practices in some cases. But in more than one case, what happens with these Baconians is that they actually come from more than one communities of practice. Some of them come from more seriously organized communities of practices of mechanical arts, as in the project of trades, or there is clearly a community of practices around husbandry and gardening. I don't know about natural philosophy, but all these people coming from different communities of practice can work together in a Baconian natural history. So they, as if, okay, let's say, do they form a new community of practice, or can they work together because they work towards the development of a new discipline? That would be the interesting questions for me here. I don't have an answer, but I think it's relevant to think in terms of communities and practice and disciplines in this particular case. Now, sects. Is there a Baconian sect? Not clear, because Baconian is, as opposed to other sects, Baconian is usually self-attributed. People are claiming that they are Baconians to a much higher rate than they dare to claim they are Cartesians, or at least in England, or Epicureans, or any other sect. So it's rather self-attribution. So that leads in the direction of it's not a sect, it's a school. On the other hand, the allegiance to Bacon is very non-dogmatic. So there is no allegiance to the head of the sect in the sense in which we think that, even Calvinists are more or less bowing in front of Calvin himself. What Baconians borrow from Bacon are methods and ideas rather than theories, and especially experiments and recipes. And they are set to work on these experiments and recipes with a clear feeling that they help improving these experiments. And there's also a clear feeling that this is part of Bacon's legacy, to criticize, improve, make it better, which would go against taking into consideration the idea that there is a Baconian sect behind the natural and experimental history. Now, a school is more probable, and probably is interesting to think in terms of a school, and I haven't so far. So to me, this is kind of an opening up into thinking more about 17th century Baconianism along the lines of adding to the disciplines and communities of practice this notion of a school, because there's clearly a Baconian style of gathering natural and experimental histories. So, and also a way of learning how to become a Baconian, which we tend to perhaps connect with a school. And you have the feeling that, let's say, people from different communities of practice, say more natural philosophical and more trade-oriented, working together on vegetation and fermentation, for example, they learn how to work together, and they learn something of this common style from Bacon. So by reading Bacon, by understanding what Bacon's natural histories want, they get closer to having common practices. Therefore, I think that it is useful for my historical example to think at least in terms of community of practices and in terms of a school, although I still need to think more about the school business, and take disciplines as a sort of end point towards which all these practitioners are aiming. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. All right, questions? Terry Bristol.
So I hate to have somebody present something so wonderful and not have opportunity to ask some questions. So yeah, I had a couple of things. It seems to me that Bacon, I mean, as I go up, I was very much into the pragmatist tradition, and Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce was, one of his big, famous essays was to distinguish between two approaches to questions. One was arguing that all meaningful questions begin in practice. And I think this connects with Bacon's idea, knowledge is power. In other words, that I think I can't remember the expression you used, the special powers. In other words, what Bacon saw knowledge, the purpose of knowledge was, in fact, for powers. And I think that this is, I think I'm going to get in this quick. So the purpose of knowledge is always knowledge of how to do things, ultimately. And I'm thinking of Leibniz had a really beautiful thing about why would we want to know the anatomy of the body? Okay. And so it looks like this is a completely, abstract scientific thing, anatomy of the body. But in fact, what he said, the purpose of that is so that we can have a social medicine. Okay. So we can help people understand how better to live, how to, do things. So the whole idea of the study of that was always within the context of actually of practice, of power of doing things. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
Well, I don't dispute your position. don't know how to answer to it.
Okay, so knowledge is about power, so he's seeking always to do something. It's not just, I mean, it's the distinction historically and modern is.
Right. It's not about power in the sense in which it was interpreted, but indeed, for Bacon, the ideal, of course, is what is called scientia activa. So the ideal and fully developed science will have both a theoretical part and a practical part.
Okay, but I would just suggest, I think that he's saying that the practical is the more fundamental context. In other words, all the questions that you're going to ask
I
are
don't think
ultimately going to be about practice.
you cannot have one without the other. That's the point. So you have to have both, and then if you have both, you have it's a very complicated discussion actually. So I don't think I can make.
Just say one thing is that I'm big on engineering as a framework, which is distinct from science. And in engineering, I would say agricultural engineering is about how do we design our fields? Well, then you have how do we design our houses? Well, that's architecture. Well, how do we design our cities? Well, that's urban design. Well, how do we design our economy? Are we going to have tariffs, a common currency? These are all design questions which you have to test. Then you have the political thing. And what's the political design? Well, at that point, you're at Plato's Republic. But it's all very much the context of practice, of how we should live, how we should do things. And that, to me, it seems to me that that's the general context within which Bacon should be understood, and Leibniz and various other people in philosophy of engineering. Of course, you agree with all this. So.
That is an interesting framework, but I'm afraid we have to hurry and have Sophie ask her question.
Okay, again, Sect School. Well, thank you, Dana. I just wanted to make the point that it seems to me that there are different questions. One of them is when we want to designate this kind of group of people. So the first one would be, is it a self-identification or are you identified by somebody else? And in the case of self-identification, I would say that there are different ways of doing that. You can say, I am a Baconian, but you can also use words like history. Natural history is obviously something that comes from Bacon, so that in a sense, you identify yourself as Baconian simply by using this expression. Then you have another question, which is it a negative or a positive valuation, so to speak? And of course, if you self-identify yourself as a Baconian, normally you think that Baconianism is a positive thing. But then in the case of being identified as a Baconian, you can either have a positive or a negative valuation. And the last question would be, I think, and it might perhaps explain why you don't feel so comfortable by using the word, well, I don't remember, sect or school for Bacon, is, and that's what I wanted to say with party.
School.
But you can replace it by family if you prefer that. And it's not only about ideas, it's about a group of people, and you know that you belong to this group. You are part of a group. And in the case, for example, of Gassendists, whom I know better than Baconians, they were not so much, they didn't have that kind of feeling in France, at least, because they were in different social places, contrary to the Cartesians. So it's a third question that I wanted to insist on, because I have the impression that first one should distinguish more carefully the two first questions, but also add this dimension of belonging to a kind of group of people.
Yeah,
but
you're right.
real people. I mean, not only, not only we have the same ideas, but we go to the
Yeah, no, I
same
understand
places,
perfectly well what you're saying, Sophie. The problem with the self-identified Baconians is that they have less, I think, the feeling of the family than Cartesians have. Actually, they don't have the feeling of a family. What they do have is the feeling that somehow they share common goals and a common methodology. So it would be more like, I'm in the School of History of Science, or I'm in the School of History of Science at Bucharest. I'm not very pleased with that, but that's how people are doing stuff around me. And these are my limitations, and I'm going along. Maybe it's a bit too strong now to say that there are limitations, but what I'm trying to say is that you don't only have school-like feeling by having positive attitudes. You identify yourself as belonging to the school, but you can have this as a sort of limitative methodology. And you still identify yourself because that's how you do things, that's how you work. And again, in this case, we are talking about people that are doing things together. And they use this as a common ground to do things together, because otherwise they are very different. Boyle, for example, is a corpuscularian. Evelyn is less a corpuscularian and more of a vitalist at some point in his life. So they have very different matter theories and allegiances and probably idols as well. But they identify themselves as belonging to this, okay, let's call it the School of Baconians, although it's not a family, it's more like a methodology-driven group. And it's not a party either, because they don't have strong views. They don't want to impose Bacon as anything. They want to impose themselves by working along these lines.
Thank you, Dana. Dimitri Levitin.
Hi, thanks, David, and thanks, Dana, for organizing this and for editing the book. Since you asked me to write for it, I've actually, like Sophie, have been wondering what you guys mean by scientific revolution. And since you guys have come out and clearly said you believe in it, I'm wondering what your chronology of it is. I think David at one point talked about the 17th century. Obviously, Dana, you have because of Bacon. I started my chapter much earlier. And if I look at, say, the Fellows of the Royal Society, the majority of them are trained physicians, and they're engaging with anatomy and medicine going back to Vesalius, if not before. And if we look at astronomy, we can go even back further. Is Regiomontanus part of scientific revolution? And if he is, why not Nasir al-Tusi and the Muslims who inspire him? And then what do you guys want to do with the 18th century? One of the most interesting chapters was by Marius Stan, I thought, on dynamical laws. And if anything, in this volume looks like modern science, David, to use your term, it's that tradition culminating in Laplace. And then, before that, you'd have people like Huygens, who don't get much of a say in this book, which is tilted towards people who look like philosophers in the modern sense of the word. So what's your chronology, at least to start with?
I guess I'll jump in on this one. Dimitri, you're asking a question that has been posed to me by Sophie and Sorana here as well, somewhere along the line. And I guess that the answer to this, that I don't want to answer this question. The problem with trying to avoid the question is that it sort of, I have to lay my own cards on the table and say and be a little bit dogmatic about what I mean by the scientific revolution. And I can do that, but more generally, the idea is that, well, if we take the scientific revolution to be a collection of these disciplinary transformations, then you can sort of let the boundaries be a little bit fuzzy. Now, my own view is that I think of the scientific revolution as the emergence of something, and then all of the disciplinary transformations that are relevant to that emergence are the threads that lead into that and become the modern scientific tradition. Donna talks about this disciplinary drive, this drive to create disciplines, and so on her view, and I don't mean to speak for you, Donna, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's this drive to create new disciplines. So it's this innovative drive, and so the scientific revolution is when that becomes evident. And so you can debate. I mean, it's quite possible to debate what the bounds of these phenomena are, but if you take that as your focal meaning, either of these views, if you take that as your focal meaning, then there are going to be things that are proximate and distal to that focal meaning, and somewhere along the line you draw the boundary.
Yeah, but you have exactly the same problem if you talk about Reformation. When do you draw the boundaries of Reformation? Okay, you have Luther's thesis, but then what? You have a Reformation going all the way up to the 20th century. Why should, we don't necessarily need to draw such clear boundaries, because we don't talk about the Kuhnian concept of an event, or the old concept of an event in time. We talk about really a bag of features, a bag of transformations, and we just conventionally call them scientific. I'm happy to.
What are these features?
I'm happy to renounce the term and put another term there for this kind of bag of changes, okay? Bag of big changes.
So what do you say to the continuists, to Lindbergh, the people who say that actually medieval nature knowledge was super productive, that in fact it's a complete construction of later, including early modern traditions, to caricature it as stale and unproductive? Revolution implies speed. So it implies some kind of change, because if it's just pure continuity, then there's nothing happening that's different.
I think it doesn't imply speed. It implies discontinuity. It implies some sort of what we started with in our book was two kinds of discontinuities. Sharp discontinuities, when a discipline let's say emergence, or two disciplines split or whatever, it's a sharp discontinuity, and points of inflection, like in mathematics, like in a curve, that a certain curve suddenly changes the angle, and it takes off in a completely different direction. And these are the kinds of changes that we see from the 16th century onwards. I agree that you don't see them only then, but what you see in the 17th century is a multiplicity of points of inflection and disciplinary discontinuities, or emergence, or branching off new disciplines from existing disciplines, and so on. And I would even go as far to say that by convention, we call this bunch of very serious discontinuities with the name scientific revolution. But if you want to, Dan at some point was talking about scientific reformation. I was talking about scientific reformation at some point. To me, what is important is the discontinuity factor. And in this sense, I'm opposing continuities, let's say, not in the sense I'm not saying that there were no big changes in the Middle Ages or in the Hellenistic period or new disciplines there.
Yes, and to
Dan?
sorry.
David, were you? Sorry.
Yeah,
David, go ahead.
And the advantage of, and so the response to the continuitist is like the continuitist view is that you can say, well, okay, there was this multiplicity of transformations in this period, and you're happy to say, okay, but the influences and causes of that stretch all the way back, and the ramifications stretch all the way forward. So there is a response there.
Dan, do you have a finger?
And by just adding one more complexity to the story, Donna talks about inflection points, something different happening. There was another school of sort of discontinuities through continuity. If you look at Gassendi, he was doing something new by reviving Epicureanism. That was yet another strategy that people used in this period to disrupt the currently accepted view of the world by going back to another ancient who wasn't Aristotle. And there certainly were Stoics, there were Epicureans, varieties of other kinds of people. That was, I think that what this discussion may show is how difficult it is to put your finger on what it meant to have a scientific revolution. And in my mind, together with, Sophie and Dimitri and maybe Terry, raising some questions about whether or not we should keep on talking about a scientific revolution. Something happened, and it was wonderful to have an opportunity to discuss it. But in the end, I'm not sure that we come away with a clearer idea of what it was. But even so, thank you very much. I am looking forward to having an opportunity to read all of the other essays in what looks like a wonderful read, a wonderful volume.
Thank you. Let's all give them a round of applause, maybe. Okay, so thank you for joining us to the session on a bag of big changes that maybe were small, the scientific revolution. Next week, we will have a panel on aesthetics, first, I think, for our seminar. So hope to see many of you there. And thanks again to Dana and to David.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks to you all.